Oh, hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box, where today I want to talk about one of these elephants in the room of the recording studio, as it were, and that's look at all of the legacy acts that are either retired or on the verge of retirement. And these are acts from the most profitable decades of the music industry, the 70s and 80s, and in some cases into the 90s. These were decades where, with a few very small downturns, the music industry as a financial and pop cultural behemoth was going from strength to strength. So, what happens when the artists of this era, the popular ones, the well known ones, the beloved ones, the critically acclaimed ones, what happens when they hang it up and go to that great Joe Biden Delaware beach in the sky? Now, it's an interesting question. And for this, we have to examine the concept of compositions which outlast the initial performances. Now, obviously, there's one genre of music that has no problem with this at all. In fact, multiple interpretations are considered a greatly beneficial occurrence in this genre, and this is European classical music. We listen to the compositions of Mozart, Haydn, Handel, Vivaldi, Beethoven, Schubert, Schumann, Mendelssohn, Liszt, Wagner, Bruckner, Strauss, Tchaikovsky, Mussorgsky, Dvorak, the list goes on. Now, these are very different composers from very different eras, but there is one thing they all have in common. They're dead. They're very, very dead, but their music has lived on long after they shook off the mortal coil and all of that jazz. Now, why is this? Well, it's for several reasons. One, unlike many folkish types of music, European classical music is literate, and this means that it's written down. That doesn't mean that the interpretations are stale. There's a school of thought that I detest and thinks they should. I think that part of the composition 50% of it is what's on the page. The other 50% is how the maestro or the ensemble interpret it and make it their own, create their own authentic emotional statement. But nevertheless, these compositions that we all know and love, they exist in many cases centuries after the death of their creators. Now, when pop music became a thing at the turn of the 20th century, we saw people that would have otherwise been contented with generally musically illiterate folkish traditions. You see these musicians develop a more stratified, a professionalized way of both composing and performing music. And it is when you put the profit motive and the artistic refinement into songs and music that we listen to outside of the grand concert halls and opera houses, where folk music transformed into pop music as we know it today. And when we look at pop music, we can say that music of the golden age of pop, classic pop as they now call it, those songs have stood the test of time in the sense that when the composers, people like Rodgers and Hart, for instance, when Irving Berlin, when these people, long after they've died, the music lives on, and even long after the deaths of some of the singers and other musicians who popularized these compositions are long gone, we still know the songs. They're called standards. They're called the Great American Songbook. The key is in the names. People want to perform the songs, even though the people who wrote them or initially made them well known are long gone. And you see so many people reviving it at a professional level. Rod Stewart, famously, for decades now, has toured with the Great American Songbook. You see other people who love standards. Lady Gaga loves standards. You can still go into a hotel or a bar, and if there's a live act there, a live pianist, they will usually be playing some, if not most, of their material derived from these great standards of modern pop music. Jazz too. Jazz has taken the standards and adapted them into jazz standards. And then look at jazz compositions themselves. John Coltrane died in the 1960s, but you can still hear things like Giant Steps and A Love Supreme being performed by musicians at jazz clubs and on YouTube and in other places all over the world. So let's just recap the music, the different genres of music that have outlasted the lifetimes of their composers or their most famous and or original performers. You've got one, European classical music. Two, you've got the classic pop standards, Great American Songbook. Three, you've got jazz, both in terms of jazz, famous jazz arrangements of these standards, and in terms of compositions written by jazz musicians. Herbie Hancock, look at all of his stuff, Chameleon, Watermelon Man. People play that. Even though Herbie Hancock is luckily very much alive, but these are not contemporary songs. They're from decades ago. And what other genres can we put on this list? Liturgical music, obviously, that's different because it's got a very specific spiritual component, but it still withstands the test of time. Music for occasions. Not many people even know the names of the composers of our favorite Christmas songs, but those endure because they commemorate an occasion, and every year we tend to listen to most of the same songs. And yes, new Christmas songs continue to be written, but Rudolph and Frosty and those jingle bells are never going to go away. So we've got that. Now let's look at the world of rock, because in the world of rock, most of those musicians who wrote and performed those songs, most are still alive, many are still touring, but a lot are, nearing retirement and they're going away. And so, like jazz and like classic pop before it, rock is no longer the primary musical language of the pop music world. It was between the 60s, certainly the late 60s and the early 2000s. But in the 90s, there was a shift where hip hop became domineering. And for the last 20 years, the musical language of pop has been hip hop. Think things like samples, think things like drum machines, think things like synth pads, in the same ways that the pop music of the 70s, 80s, and early 90s was all about electric guitar, live drums, electric bass, Fender Rhodes piano, Hammond organ, synthesizers that were then derived from and inspired from those other instruments like the Prophets and the Oberheims. So we've got to grapple with the idea of what next rock and roll. We know that rock is no longer the primary language of the pop music landscape, but is it going to endure in terms of compositional performance? In other words, well, I don't want to wish anyone harm, but um, when the last of the great rock and roll bands go away, when people die, and when that happens, will people still be performing this music? Will they still be listening to it in any meaningful way apart on some little niche radio, Sirius XM stations and some not very listened to Spotify playlists? It's a very important question. Now, weirdly, while hip hop is still very much a music of today, I actually think that hip hop repetition and performance after the founders of the genre and after the great artists who made the big hits, even when they go away, I think hip hop will last because quoting and referencing and shout outs is a big part of hip hop culture. In the same way that musical quotations are a part of jazz, lyrical quotations, lyrical shout outs are a big part of hip hop. And I think that I could be wrong. And while I'll hear a lot of hip hop critics say, oh, the young generation doesn't pay their respects to the OGs, I think that once hip hop becomes old and when a new language, a new musical language comes to dominate pop music, I think we'll see a lot of shout outs to the OGs in the same way that young jazz musicians do instrumental shout outs to various licks and various compositions and even various solos played by the greats, the Birds, the Coltrane's, the Mileses, the Bill Evanses, the Chick Coreas, the titans of sort of that golden age of contemporary jazz. So rock, though, is an interesting question. Obviously, cover bands exist and they've existed for a long time. And one thing that has been interesting is rock is one of the few genres where ultra professionalized cover bands exist. Now, in the world of classic pop, there were these American songbook standards that were sung by multiple people around the same time. Within a span of a few years, so many different people recorded All or Nothing at All. Within a span of a few years, so many people recorded Born Free, which became a latter day standard. But when it comes to actually sort of mimicking the performance style, the staging, the costumery, the presentation of rock bands, we see that even within the lifetime of a lot of these bands, you see very polished tribute bands. Now, when the music itself retreats from the spotlight even more so, will we see more of these tribute bands or fewer? It's an interesting question that I think rock fans out there are really going to need to come up with some interesting and original answers too. And I'd love to hear your perspectives in the comments whenever you come to watch this. So that's my thought for the day. It's going to be a short stream. I gave you a long one yesterday, and the show is free, so stop your complaining. So that really is the question: will these genres that are retreating into the back of people's minds, will they survive? Will they outlast the composers and the famous performers who initially played them? We know the examples from history. We don't really know what's going to happen contemporarily. I think it's going to be very interesting to watch and learn and find out. As always, like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.